Well, we're now talking about um, building skyscrapers and building cities up. We talked about steel girders and concrete. A couple other things you needed. One was the elevator, and you had a guy named Elisha Otis who developed the elevator because who wants to lug, all the things that you're carrying up 34 stories or 25 stories? Um, that would be ridiculous. So once you had elevators, you could go up and down multiple floors, quite wide variety of multiple floors, quickly and easily. The other thing that had to develop was central heating. Otherwise, everybody's heating their space in the skyscraper with a fireplace or wood stove. If you can imagine hauling loads of firewood up 15 flights of steps or even bringing it into the elevator, that wouldn't be much fun. And it would kind of take up a lot of time that you could better and would much rather use doing other things. So they came up with central steam heat. They'd have a boiler in the basement, heated by coal that would then pipe steam throughout the various parts of the building and through the old steam coil radiators. They also devised for housing in the immigrant neighborhoods what they called tenement buildings, which were really cheap, low-cost housing. And where they would build that is in close to the center of the city, because the poorer people in the working classes couldn't afford the streetcar fares that they need to pay if they lived further out from the center of the city. So they developed these really cheap, quickly constructed large-scale apartment buildings that were built in the shape of almost a dumbbell, which is why they were called dumbbell tenements, where you'd have the two main buildings, and then connecting the two of them a small narrow passage, so it looked almost like a dumbbell that you could curl. And that was the main type of working class housing in these big late 19th century cities. They were overcrowded. They weren't real well ventilated. People would cram, their extended family into a one-room flat, a one-room apartment, and so you had a lot of people living right in close proximity to each other, on top of each other. Our modern idea of privacy, forget it. It's gone. You didn't have it. It also made it a lot easier, unfortunately, for disease and things like that to spread around. So they were not, the best available housing or the best potential housing, but it was as good as it got for the working classes in the inner cities. And of course, one of the big problems was fire. They were largely wood construction framed, and if fire started, there was very little to stop it. Okay, well, that being said, that leads us to our next set of problems, and that was, how do we deal with the fact that these cities grew extremely large, extremely fast? Well, the cities themselves, the residents, the governments, the infrastructure simply weren't ready for it. It happened so quickly that it kind of caught everybody unaware. And because the cities grew so much, so rapidly, there were all kinds of problems. You had to deal with waste, you had to deal with pollution, disease, crime, all those things. And of course, all this stuff kind of erupted in the urban setting, and nobody was ready for it. So at first, they did virtually nothing that was effective to control it all. But over time, slowly you had people that were sort of public advocates who got involved and focused on certain issues in the cities, and they convinced both their fellow residents of the city and the city governments to start to provide municipal services to the people in the cities. Things like water purification facilities, sewage systems, waste disposal, trash, street lights. Started out with gas lamps in the cities with street lights, and then eventually went to electricity. Police department, and eventually zoning laws too. because you really didn't want to have a slaughterhouse 2 doors down from where you were living in your apartment or your townhome, because, number one, the noise, the animals being slaughtered would be no fun, and the smell would make you want to move pretty far away pretty fast. Likewise, you wouldn't want to have a leather tannery right down the street. That was probably the most foul-smelling business you could possibly imagine back then. So, anyway, what's going to happen because of the rapid development of these cities? The city governments aren't going to be equipped to handle the problems. What's going to end up happening is the development of urban political machines and boss and machine politics in the cities. What ended up happening typically is the political parties in a city ended up under the control of really tightly controlled, organized groups of politicians that became known as political machines, because they seemingly operated with lockstep, almost machine-like precision. Each political machine or organization had a boss who gave the orders, and his biggest asset was his ability to hand out and award city jobs. So it was patronage. It was like the spoils system that we've been talking about going all the way back to Andrew Jackson, but practiced on a very local level, on an urban municipal level in the cities. The best known of these urban political machines of the late 19th and early 20th century was Tammany Hall in New York. It started as a social club, and it eventually turned into this big urban power center in New York City. And because there weren't institutions in place to coordinate and provide the services that were desperately needed in these cities, the machines and the political bosses took on these responsibilities. Sometimes what they did was they would, for example, greet immigrants at the docks as they got off the ship entering a city like New York. And they would assist in finding them housing, help them, with getting jobs, making sure that they had something to eat or whatnot. And what they expected down the road in return for helping these people out was their votes. And once these immigrants became American citizens and were able to vote, then the political machine would expect that, if you were helped out by the political machine, why, come election day, your way of paying them back was to vote their operatives, continue to vote their operatives into office. So the machines have it's kind of a mixed bag situation. The upside was they provided desperately needed services that weren't being provided otherwise. And they did end up helping a lot of people. The downside is there was a catch. They wanted to stay in power, and they wanted votes. And they became, this is the era during which everyone's trying to rip everyone else off. They became masters of, the political machines and bosses, ripping people off through illegitimate vote counts. What I mean by that, ballot box stuffing was rife. Whoever was in charge of counting the votes, who were the city election boards, why, they had a lot of influence on who actually won. And you'd have bizarre situations where a ward in a city had 500 eligible voters living there, and 1,500 people actually voted on election day. And these urban political bosses had this amazing power to raise the dead. Yes, they could bring people back from the dead. How do we know that? Well, on election day, you'd see the voter list of people who voted. There'd be scads of deceased individuals who came back on election day to cast their ballot. Their commitment to democracy was that strong that it transcended the grave. These guys were masters at securing a very, very important segment of the vote, the resurrected vote. We'll be back.